Your CFI analysis. Where do we start? Where are we going to start with our analysis? What number? Because all your presentations should start at the same place. Where do we start? Well, talk about this is the sheet. On the sheet, where do we start when trying to explain this? Well, I would say free cash flow. We start with the first section, the operating free cash flow. And as I said, start with the 3.5868 billion. 3.6 billion of free cash flow. Because as I said, it's going to be telling as to how you do your analysis. If positive, then where did the cash go? Okay? If I'm making money from my job, did I put in the bank? Did I pay off some debt? Did I put it in my savings account? Pay off my parents? What did I do with the money? All right. If I'm losing money, where did I get the money from? As I said, free cash flow is where we start. It's going to be telling how we frame the analysis. But then we got to explain, why do we have $3.6 billion worth of free cash flow? Next point he mentioned out, income statement, gross cash flow, $8.5 billion over the 5 years. All right. But interestingly, how did we get to $8.5 billion? Well, we started with $5.8 billion in 2014. We dropped to 2015's $1.7 billion. We lost $3.7 billion in 2016, $651 in 17, 2018, $3.9 billion. So essentially, we had that pothole Boeing effect here on our income statement. Again, probably with the falling price of oil and revenue associated with that. What happened to gross investment? For some reason, the investment rate didn't carry over. But we had $4.2 billion of gross investment on $8.5 billion, so about a 50% reinvestment rate on the $8.5 billion of gross cash flow. But again, it kind of bowed. $3.9 billion of gross investment in 14. That's when oil prices were $100 a barrel. It fell to negative disinvestment of $3.7 billion. This is where the invested rate percentage will trick you, because we actually had negative gross cash flow and negative gross investment. But it looks like it's a positive reinvestment rate. It doesn't mean they're spending money. It's the double negatives are canceling it out, and actually they're disinvesting. Okay? So that's where percentage change can trick you. 2017, started generating a little cash. They started reinvesting again. 2018, generate more cash. Capital expenditures went to $2 billion, and gross investment rate went to 62%. So essentially, it's not that the 294 said that they overinvested. It's the 294% had more to do with the 651 of gross cash flow, right? In terms of the actual magnitude, they actually invested more in 18 than 17. But because they had such little gross cash flow in 17, made the investment rate look high, right? So that's why I go back to just clinically saying the numbers, a little misleading here on what's going on because of the nature of their business. Now, once you go through the total, then you're going to, okay, how did $3.6 billion of free cash flow become $1 billion of CFI to distribute? Two general things. It's either usually excess cash or non-operating assets. In the case of Haliburton, it was a $2.5 billion increase in non-operating assets. Almost all of that occurred in 2016, $2.2 billion of it, primarily when they're at the bottom of their dip. They had $1 billion to pay out. How did they distribute it? Interestingly, they had $1.2 billion of interest payments and $1 billion of CFI. They're in a little bit of a different situation than the other companies we looked at. Yes, they borrowed $2.6 billion worth of debt, but they got their MasterCard to pay their Visa. Okay? Because they used some of this debt just to pay off the debt that was already out there, not necessarily just to fund their business. This was a different situation than some of the other companies like McDonald's and others that we looked at previously, which were generating so much cash flow they didn't need to borrow the money. Here, they were actually borrowing the money. And again, when did the borrowing occur? A lot of it occurred in 2015, $7.5 billion. We started paying it back in 16, $2.9 billion, $17 billion and a half. Interestingly, they paid dividends consistently that increased every year over 5 years. 533 to 614 to 620 to 626 to 630. When the business hit the dip, they didn't change their dividend policy. They actually kept increasing their dividends. What they did stop was the share repurchase. They bought back $1.2 billion worth of stock, but they only bought it back in 14 and 19 or 18. When the business dipped, 15, 16, and 17, they stopped the share repurchase. Okay? They didn't stop the dividend, but they stopped the share repurchase. That's what's going on with Haliburton. Right? So again, obviously a little context is helpful. Minimum clinical walk through the numbers. What's really different, that I've just put a little curveball out there, is traditionally we're assuming sales are staying relatively constant. So when the investment to sales ratio changes, or when the profit to sales ratio changes, we're assuming it's either cost or we're assuming it's either investment that's driving the change. All right? What makes it more complex is that the world is a little bit more quadratic. In this case, revenue's changing. Okay? And when revenue changes, these ratios could change, not because the cost is changing or not because the investment is changing relative to sales, but because sales are changing relative to investment. So that's what was happening to Haliburton when we did our ratios, and we see that, by the way, on the CFI. And we got to look at the revenue. So I'm going to give you the balance class time, unless there's any other questions, to work with your teams to start working on Group Case 2 for Caterpillar. Okay? Monday, take the exam during your class scheduled time. See you physically here next Wednesday to do your presentations. Remember, submit your PowerPoints by 10 a.m. You can only present what's in the PowerPoints. And make sure you have different people presenting than you did in Group Case 1. Okay? Otherwise, have a good day.